Today on the Modern Motherhood Podcast from AllMomDoes, I'm your host, Julie Lyles Carr, and this guest, she is so fascinating. What a Renaissance woman. She's primarily known by you for her novels. She's an amazing fiction writer, and she does have a new novel coming out that we'll talk about, but it's her real life that I think is so incredibly fascinating, and how she uses different experiences in her life to supplement what she's writing about. And we get to have a fantastic conversation about all kinds of things, including her experience as a transracial mom. So stay tuned, because you don't want to miss this conversation with novelist and all-around amazing person, Katie Ganshert. Katie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So Katie, tell us about you, your family, kids, all that good stuff.
Oh, man. So like you said, I write books. So that's what I do for a living. I make up stories for a living, which is pretty cool. And as far as me and my family, I live in Eastern Iowa with my husband and our 2 children and our very mischievous dog named Gus. So, and our son, he is 9 in 3rd grade, and our daughter Salima is in preschool and will start kindergarten next year.
You are in the thick of it with the little ones.
Yeah.
So how did you get into the writing game, and particularly the fiction writing?
You know, I always wrote. Like, I was always that girl who was in her bedroom with a pencil and a notebook and writing stories. In fact, for a really long time, my mom had like a couple crates of like notebooks from stories that I would write when I was a little girl. So, so I always loved to write. I think it was though around high school that I stopped, because you kind of get to that. I think 2 things happened. I fell into that comparison trap. You know, like you start comparing yourself. And then I also think in high school, something happens where you need to be more realistic. You can't just say you want to be an actress or you want to be an NBA All-Star. And I didn't know anyone who was making a living as a writer. I didn't know anyone. So I kind of felt the need to be more practical. And when I went to college, I, wrestled with a few different majors and decided on elementary education. And so it wasn't until toward the end of my college career, I went to Nairobi, Kenya for a 3-week HIV/AIDS outreach trip through the church I was going to at the time. And when I got back from that trip, I had an idea for a novel. And so I sat down and I started writing again, and I've kind of continued ever since. So I think, that was in 2005. And then my first novel wasn't published until 2012. So it was quite a journey.
So for you, did you find the lit agent first, the publisher first? Sometimes when I talk with fellow author, I write in the nonfiction lane, although I have a couple of fiction projects in the works. I'm always fascinated to see how somebody made their way into traditional publishing. So how was it for you?
Yeah, I went the traditional route of getting a literary agent. So I knew I knew that if I wanted to get published with a traditional publisher, I needed a literary agent. So for me, I think it was in 2009 that I went to my first big writing conference, and I was able to pitch in person to who is my agent now, Rochelle Gardner. She's with Books and Such Literary Agency. And so I was able to pitch to her one of my book ideas. And then a couple months later, they're busy. So you pitch face to face with them. It's pretty terrifying. And then, they say, sure, I'd like to see your stuff, or no, I don't, I'm not really interested. And thankfully she was interested. And so I sent her my stuff, and then she contacted me about a couple months later and offered me representation. And I was totally spazzy and over the moon happy. And then it took about another year for her to sell my stuff to Waterbrook Multnomah, which is the Christian imprint of Penguin Random House.
And one thing that our listeners may not know, I find fiction to be a particular act of faith in this way when it comes to trying to get published is with nonfiction, you produce this long book proposal that is, I think a couple of mine have been 10, 12,000 words, and it's not even the book. It's the proposal. But in fiction, generally, you have to write the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. You write the book. Although it does change once you've gotten published. So when I was pre-published, I think by the time my agent sold my first book, I had 3 full-length novels already written I had 5, but 2 of them were practice novels that I would never show to anyone anymore. But the 3 that I had finished, I was really proud of, and I thought all of these could get published, and I would like for people to read them. And so I had already written those books. What I found more terrifying was later when you get to once you get past that first contract, then they trust you more, and they're like, okay, just pitch us an idea. If we like it, we know you can write the book. So we'll give you the contract, we'll give you the advance, but now you got to write the book. I found that more terrifying. When you're like, okay, they've paid me and I have a deadline and I haven't actually written the book. Like, that was a little bit scary.
So what is your advice to listeners out there who really feel like they've got a book on their heart, but they're feeling it's difficult to justify the kind of time, even if you're a fast writer, writing it means you have to write. I mean, it takes a lot of time. So what's your encouragement for listeners out there who are thinking, I've got this story on my heart, but how do I justify this in my busy mom life and my other work life? Sitting down and getting the words, into that computer file.
Yeah. I think if it's something that you really feel like is on your heart and you feel like it's something you feel compelled to share with the world, it's kind of like any priority. I mean, any of the worthwhile things in life are going to take time, and there's not always a guarantee that you're going to see. You don't know how it's going to pan out. But I will say that even if it doesn't get published by a traditional publisher, even if you end up doing it yourself, or just the act of writing is such an act of faith. And so, I don't know, like, it molds your character that I don't think it's time wasted. So, for me, what that looked like, before I was published was I was teaching, full time. My son was a baby. And then when I left my teaching job, I think he was about 2.5. So for those 2 years, I was teaching 5th grade. I had a son, I had my husband, and I would get up at like 4 a.m. So you find time, I'd do my quiet time, and then I would spend about an hour and a half writing before I even went to work in the morning. So it takes discipline, and it takes a whole lot of motivation. So, a lot of people, I'm sure you run into this too, is will say, I've got a story. I'd like to write a story someday. But if it's really on your heart and you need to get on the page, it's just a matter of carving out the time and kind of prioritizing it.
Absolutely.
It's hard though.
It is. Yeah. But I think if you've got that story, it usually pounds in your chest. You let it be told. So tell our listeners what genre of fiction that you primarily write in.
Primarily is inspirational contemporary fiction. So there's, usually going to be an element of faith in my stories, and just usually main characters are women, although in Life After I had a guy and a girl. So yeah, just stories of characters, flawed characters wrestling with life and faith and things like that.
And the inspirational fiction lane is really just gathering all kinds of steam. I myself have actually done a lot of audiobooks and done the narration for a lot of inspirational fiction within the Christian lane. And it's amazing to me, all of the titles and how much need and desire there is, even in the audiobook lane, whether you love paper books, your Kindle, your ebooks, or the audiobooks, just that particular genre has really grown. What do you think it is about that genre that is speaking so strongly into the lives of women today?
Yeah, I don't know. But I got to just say I love audiobooks too. Like, that's how I do most of my reading, is listening to audiobooks. They're so good. I don't know. I've never been super good at like following trends or keeping up with patterns of, what's hot, what's not. It does seem like this inspirational category is growing and expanding at a really cool rate. But when you're in it and you hear all about the industry, you start getting into any industry and you're hearing talk about it. There's the side of it, like, it's growing and this, but then there's doom and gloom, like no one's reading Christian fiction anymore. So I think you kind of hear it on all sides, but something cool that I see is just this willingness to kind of dig into some pretty complex, relevant issues, and readers willing to go there. So, for No One Ever Asked, my most recent, it's diving into racial injustice, particularly in the education system. So, maybe it's always been that way and I just haven't stumbled across the right books, but I kind of see that the tide going that way, and that's pretty encouraging because it's nice to be able to, these issues that are impacting and affecting our real everyday life, to be able to explore those in the safety of fiction, I think is pretty cool.
And I look, too, at the way that Jesus always taught, which was in the context, if you will, of inspirational fiction, right?
Yep. Parables.
There were things that he was able to say and get across that rather than maybe pointing a bony finger of conviction at someone, he was able to get them there through the vehicle of a great parable. So do you feel that you are sharing parables in a sense? Is that part of the mission behind your writing?
It's definitely part of the mission. I think exactly what you just said, obviously, so Jesus knew this about story. The power of story was that it gets to hearts in ways that statistics and facts and articles just can't. Do you know? Right. When you're reading a story, this amazing thing happens where you actually get a step into somebody else's shoes and live their experience. So I can't remember who I heard say this, but I loved it. And it was that story is a training ground for empathy, and I think that's so true, because you always say, well, until you've walked a mile in someone else's shoes, you can't really speak to their situation. But then when you do read a story, in a sense, you are walking that mile in their shoes. And so my mission, especially for this latest one that I wrote, No One Ever Asked, was to just increase that sense of empathy over issues that are so polarizing and then we tend to have these hard and fast opinions about without actually stepping into someone else's shoes. And so just really praying over that story and hoping that hearts would be softer when they finish the story.
Yeah, I believe I've heard Sarah Mackenzie, Read Aloud Revival, Read Aloud Family, talk about that part of why she loves reading aloud stories to her kids is because it reinforces that empathy muscle. It really helps them identify with different characters, exactly along the lines of what you're saying. So give us a snapshot of your newest book that's coming out.
Okay, so No One Ever Asked it's a story about three very different women. And their lives are brought together when an impoverished school district loses its accreditation, and the affluent community of Crystal Ridge really has no choice but to open their school doors. It is inspired by real events, and it explores all kinds of things like the implicit bias impacting American society, the invisible fences that keep us separated, and really just kind of explores the question, what does it mean to be human? So.
And you based some of this, if I understand correctly, on your experience of adoption. How did that play into all of this?
So backing up just a little, when I say it's inspired by real events, it's also influenced by some of my experiences. But the real events were, I first heard about this situation when I was listening to another podcast called This American Life. It's a pretty popular podcast.
Love that podcast.
So maybe you've heard this episode. It was a specific episode. It was called The Problem We All Live With. And it was featuring investigative reporter Nicole Hannah-Jones. And she covers race in the United States, specifically race in American education. And she was basically sharing about this modern day integration story wherein a Missouri school district comprised almost entirely of low-income Black and brown students lost their accreditation, and it triggered this law in Missouri that allowed these students who were previously locked into these failing schools because of their zip code the opportunity to transfer to a mostly white affluent district nearby. And as you can imagine, there were very strong opinions and reactions on all sides. And so I listened to that podcast and I was like, oh my goodness, my heart was already there with racial justice and all that stuff. I was already, because of my daughter and having a Black daughter and wanting to understand what her experience might be like growing up, my heart was already there, reading about all these, what the reality is there. And so I listened to this podcast and I was gripped. And I just wanted, and that's how I deal. That's how I explore things. Process is writing. So I was like, I want to write the story. So it's a novel. No One Ever Asked really explores a lot of issues that are relevant today, like race and systems of injustice, implicit bias, education, school choice is a huge thing. And I knew that I wanted to explore these issues in a nuanced, realistic way. So I basically created three characters who all are impacted differently by the situation. And because of their life experiences, see the situation differently. You've got Camille Gray, and she's a white mother of three. She's living in the affluent community. Her husband is a corporate exec. She's a longstanding chairwoman of the PTA. Really, from the outside looking in, she looks like she's got it all together. Of course, you learn, like with most people, that from the outside looking in, a lot of people look like they have it all together, and you need to peel back those layers and discover she's kind of having a crisis in her own life. And one of the other characters is Anaya Jones, and she's African-American. She's from the failing district. She has a younger brother who goes to school in the failing district. She also just graduated college and accepted her first teaching position at one of the elementary schools in the affluent district. So I was able to pull some of my experience as a teacher to kind of bring some, some realism to Anaya's character. But then my third character, which gets us back to the transracial adoption piece, is Jen Covington. And Jen is white. She's middle class. She's new to town. And she recently adopted a young girl from Liberia. And this is where I was able to pull from my own experience, because I'm an adoptive mom of a little girl, not from Liberia, but from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I think my familiarity with that, all that goes into that, allowed me to kind of write Jen in a way that's pretty authentic.
We'll be right back with our conversation with novelist Katie Ganshert here in just a moment. But first, wanted to make sure that Compassion International is on your radar. I mean, why wait? Go ahead and sponsor a kid today and do some amazing good in the world.
Hi, my name is McKenna Jane Carr, and when I was 17 years old, I began sponsoring 2 children through Compassion International. I'm now in my mid-20s, and I'm still sponsoring those 2 kids who are now teenagers. I believe that decision has helped me to be intentional with my finances and has helped shape my approach to giving back to a broader world. I'd love for you to experience the same thing for just over $1 a day. Sponsor a child today at compassion.com/AllMomDoes.
So talk to us about the term transracial. That may be a term that some of our listeners are not familiar with. Talk about what you mean by that.
Yeah. So sometimes you'll hear interracial, right? Or transracial. It just means that we are a family that, it means a couple things. I kind of looked into this too, because I was using that term a lot, and I'm like, what does it actually mean? I always thought it to mean transracial family. We have more than one race or ethnicity in our family. But what was interesting was to think about, I think what's probably more familiar when we hear of trans is obviously like transgender. That's a very popular thing people talk about. And if you think about it in that way, like if, that we're getting into like an interesting topic here, but like a transgender person, the way I understand it, is someone who's born a male, but maybe feels quote unquote female. Well, transracial, if you think about my daughter, Salima, she's growing up in a white family with a white experience. And so she's growing up white essentially, but she's Black. Mm-hmm. So that kind of helps understand when I say transracial family, we're a white family. It could mean, we're a white family with a Black daughter. We have a different makeup of race in our family. But for her, it could also mean the world's going to look at her as Black, but she's been raised essentially white. And so it's kind of a nuanced word. There's lots of different ways to kind of look at it.
But I think it's a really important phrase. And part of why I'm so glad for you to unpack it for our listeners is that one of my best friends lives 3 doors down. Our husbands are in business together. She's my running partner. They adopted a little boy from Ethiopia several years ago. They are a white family, and he is Black, and he is being raised in a very different environment. And we've talked about the influence that will have, the challenges he may face that are unique, being a Black individual raised in a white family, the challenges he might not experience in some ways because he's been raised within a white family. And so it's a very interesting, I love that word is coming forth, because we do have a lot of individuals who have been adopted by American families, and their experience is going to be a little bit different. What are some things that you've noticed for your daughter that seem to be different right off the top?
Well, I think, I think hugely I think what you see when you adopt, and I don't know if I'm sure you and your friend have talked about this, is that very quickly as a transracial family, you realize how segregated we still are as a society. Mm-hmm. So I don't think as white people, for the white listeners, we are used to being part of the majority culture where white is so normalized and we don't even see it. I didn't realize how white my world is and was until we brought our daughter home. And all of a sudden she's like the only Black kid at the park, or she's the only Black kid in her class, or she's, and so there's a huge lack of, you just realize, whoa, we live in a very segregated society, and that's something we really had to wrestle with. So for my husband and I, we really wrestled with that because representation is so important. What does that do to her heart? You know what I mean? When she's constantly the one who's different, she's constantly the one who sticks out. It's easy. Everyone knows who Salima is because she's the little Black girl, with the white family there. So we wrestled with that a lot. And through God's prompting, we actually moved to a more diverse city. You know, it's really changed our lives in a lot of ways. And yeah, I don't even know if that really answered your question, but kind of, I think too, as she gets older is when we're really going to see how it affects her. Because like I said, you know, right now she's only 5.
Right.
So there's only, as a 5-year-old, you're not so much wrestling with your identity, but that's going to be one of our realities when she gets older and she's wrestling with her identity and who is she. And a lot of things I hear from adult adoptees who are transracial adult adoptees is that they have a hard time fitting in because they relate more to the white group because they know that culture and they know the ins and outs of that, but the world doesn't see them that way. You know, I think that's something we have to come to realize. You know, we love to think that we did a few years ago. I think a lot of us thought we lived in a post-racial society. I don't know if many of us would say that anymore.
Yeah.
But, I think we like to think we don't see things in a racialized way, but we absolutely do. And I think that's just a reality that, you know, Salim is going to have to walk through when she gets older.
Yeah, Jonathan has just turned 10 and, you know, his mama and I have definitely had a lot of conversations about, I wonder what's on the horizon for him and how we're going to be navigating this. And these are just things that we're all walking out. So what do you think are some of the assumptions or a romanticization that we make about adoption, transracial adoption, and raising kids with special needs? Because this is also another element to your story.
Yeah, and that's an element to my actual personal story. In the book, no one ever asked Jen Covington, her daughter does not have special needs, but Salima does. Salima has cerebral palsy and she has speech apraxia. So I think the assumptions, you know, it's really easy to look at our family and be inspired. Do you know what I mean? To feel the warm fuzzies, you know, when I post pictures of my daughter on Facebook, they get lots of likes. If I post a video of her, you know, working really hard on talking because speech apraxia really severely obviously impacts her speech. I get a lot of encouraging comments. I mean, 100% there's redemption. But I think what we don't realize is that it's hard. We downplay the hard that comes with redemption, I think, you know, when something is being redeemed, it's because there's lots of ugliness and a lot of dysfunction, a lot of brokenness. And so redemption is not a feel good process. It's not pretty. There's joy and there's beauty. Of course there is, but there's also a whole lot of stress. And that's what I think you don't know until you're in it when it comes to adoption, special needs parenting. It's a daily exhausting grind and it can feel very lonely. It can feel very isolating. Just like Jesus, I mean, in the garden before his crucifixion, before the ultimate redemption, right? He was so alone as the people closest to him fell asleep and he's sweating blood, you know what I mean? And praying for that cup to pass from him. And I think that's okay. It's okay if you're a special needs parent. If you're just adopted a child and they're in the process of that really hard transition where it's so hard. The first, oh my goodness, 6 months to even a year, that first year home is one of the hardest years I've ever gone through. And I think it's okay to pray, you know, Lord, let this cup pass me, heal my daughter. It's okay to pray that, but at the end of the day, I have to submit to his will and trust that, you know, even if Salima continues to struggle with speech for the rest of her life, you know, he's still sovereign and he's still good and he's still somehow working it all out for our good.
Of our 8 children, we have not built our family through adoption, but spontaneity. And so of our 8 who are identified as special needs, one with hearing loss, and our daughter Mercy has CP due to an ischemic stroke, and she's now 8. And hers resulted in left side hemiplegia, and her ability to talk us through now some of the frustration and the different things that have gone on has really been enlightening and helpful to us to understand more of what her experience is in walking this out. But you're so right. There are times that people are so well-meaning, but this whole, you're heroic. And then the people within, the parents within our community who are raising kids with special needs. And, you know, there's just this really sort of over-the-top thing at times of, wow, you must be an awfully special person for God to entrust you with this child. And I'm thinking, anytime you welcome a child into the world, this is a possibility. And it's not so much about putting on, you know, some kind of superhero cape, more than just digging in and doing it. And there are those days that are really
really hard.
Not
and
pretty.
Right. And I think the danger of that, when someone says that, like, oh, you're such a hero, or it's putting us on a pedestal. And meanwhile, we just had the worst day of our life. We're not handling it well. Like, we're freaking out, or we're snapping at our children, or we're, because it's just hard. Then it makes it hard to kind of be like vulnerable and real too. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's so important that we can be that way. All of us can be that way and say, this is really hard, and I was horrible at it today, or, whatever. So, yeah.
I think people are very well-meaning in a lot of their commentary, but I think part of what undergirds it, that I know we as a family are really passionate about trying to push people out of that place, is sometimes in that well-meaning, there's an undergirding of pity. And I feel like just saying, look, it's not about pitying her or us and then overcorrecting to a place of this, superhero mythic status. It's, you still go through stuff with your kids who are differently abled that is sort of in that typical parenting lane, in a sense, temper tantrums, or a challenge with this, or not wanting to do that, or whatever the things are. And so I love the idea that you're writing into this idea behind your new book, No One Ever Asked, what it means to walk through transracial adoption. So tell me about your fiction writing process. So do you typically start with a character who seems compelling, or is there a storyline, a topic? I know that part of the muse for your newest book, No One Ever Asked, was this podcast episode on This American Life. But is there sort of a pattern you see in your creative process, or does it just seem to fly in from different angles for different projects?
It flies in from different angles for different projects, because the first, when you ask me what do I predominantly write, it's inspirational fiction. But I have a trilogy actually that's a totally off the wall. Like, it's by K.E. Ganshert, not Katie Ganshert, only to differentiate so as not to confuse anyone. But it's a young adult, like, supernatural trilogy. So that's even, like, I've written different genres too, and the way that came to me was so much different than the way all of my stories have come to me. But, like, for No One Ever Asked, like you said, it was listening to a podcast over a topic that was already gripping me personally. Mm-hmm. From the novel before that is called Life After. And that one came through a news story, like a really random little news story that was, like, on Yahoo. You know what I mean? Like, how you can go to like Google or Yahoo and check your email and you'll see little news stories. Right. And it was this kid who miraculously survived this plane crash. I mean, they had pictures of this plane. It was completely decimated. And he not only was the sole survivor, but survived without any serious injuries. And I was like, man, what is that like? And so that inspired my story, Life After, which is essentially what is like life after a huge tragedy, and you're, dealing with survivor's guilt and stuff like that. For The Art of Losing Yourself, which was another novel that I written, that was just inspired by a passage of scripture from Ezekiel 37, when it's the Valley of Dry Bones, that one where God takes the prophet to the valley and basically asks, can these bones live again? And I just was so gripped by that passage and decided to write a story of a woman whose faith and marriage were essentially dead, and, exploring that question, can these bones live again? What can God breathe life into? So the way I get my stories are all very, like, different. I don't see a pattern. Sometimes it is like a character that just pops into my head who's very compelling, and I have to build a story around that character. But as far as my writing process, that is pretty similar for every book. Like, I spend a good deal of time brainstorming, plotting the major events in the story. I'm definitely in the fiction writing world. There are people who are called pantsers and plotters. Right.
So,
like, have you heard that?
Oh, yes.
Nonfiction world. Yeah.
So, like, your pants, or you plot it all out.
Right. I am not a pantser. Like, I can't even imagine sitting down and just starting to write a story and see where it goes. That would give me hives. So I usually like to know, like, I don't need to plot the whole thing out, but I need to know, like, what am I building toward? And then I flesh out the characters. And then I dive in and I write a truly horrendous rough draft. Like, it's so bad. It's so bad. I've instructed my husband that if I were to ever die very unexpectedly, he has to get on my computer and delete all the rough drafts from my computer so no one can see, like, how horrible they are. They're so bad. And then once I have the rough draft down, I spend a lot of time rewriting and revising. And then, of course, then I have to send it into my editor and we go through the whole process again. So it's quite a marathon, right? Finishing a book.
It is definitely a long distance sport for sure. Yeah. For you, about how long do you find it typically takes you? And are most of your projects around 100,000 words, which is another thing listeners might not know. A typical nonfiction project, usually around 50. A typical fiction, about double that. So is that about the range that you're writing in?
Yeah, it is anywhere between, like, I think all of my novels that I've written and produced could be anywhere between 80 to 105,000.
Okay. And about how long does it seem to take you from inception to completion, even with the edits and the editor involved?
Oh my goodness. Well, when the editor gets involved, it takes a whole lot longer because you know what I mean? Like, so to write a book on like my own, I've been such a slow writer lately. I used to be a lot faster, but when I get into it, I can write a book. And when I say write a book, I mean, plan it out, rough draft, and then revise into a state where I'd be okay turning it into an editor in like 6 months, 7 months, 6 months. And then once I turn it into my editor, though, then it's kind of on her plate. And then when she gets me the edits, the first round of edits are like the big edits, the comprehensive edits. And I usually get about 4 to 6 weeks to do those. And then I turn them back into my editor, and then we do line edits, and that usually takes another 4 weeks. And then copy edits are super easy on my part because it's just I have a copy editor, and I just have to approve the little tiny changes, and that doesn't take long at all.
Right, the small stuff. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it takes a long time.
So how do you make this work with your kiddos? Because I know for some of us who identify as creatives, you just never know when that creative juice is going to show up, and to have to stop and pick somebody up from T-ball or stop and make a casserole. Sometimes that can seem to interfere. So how do you make all of that dance together?
Yeah, well, that's a thing too. You're talking about what advice would you give, to someone who really wants to write a story. I think, and this is again, this idea of romanticizing something is you have to get past the idea of I'm just going to write when the muse strikes.
Right.
Like you can't, that's not realistic. You'll never get the book written unless you don't have any other obligations in life. But if you have kids, especially, you have to get your bottom in the chair and you have to get your hands on the keypad and you just have to write when time allows. And that's another thing that I think is really hard for people to understand about creatives is that for me, at least, getting into the story is like 90% of the battle. Like just starting writing is so hard for me. I don't know why I resist it as much as I do. But once I get in a groove, then it's not so bad. So a little interruption, like picking a kid up from T-ball really quick, might only seem like a 15-minute thing, but it takes you out of the story. And then all of a sudden you have to get back in it, which is like my struggle to begin with. So yeah, that's really tricky. And, but I think it takes, just a lot of discipline. And I will say with my kids, I actually told my agent this after I turned in, no one ever asked, that I need to take a little break. I can't sign another contract right now because, Salima is still in preschool. And so she's home like all morning. I don't drop her off until preschool until 12:45. So, and then she's, she gets out at 3:45. My son gets done at 3:20. Like it kind of overlaps. It's just not much time. Afternoons aren't my good time anyway. I'm most prolific in the mornings, but I have a daughter at home. So, this year's been really rough with finding writing time, but I know next year she'll be in kindergarten full time and I'll have more of my writing time back. So I just had to kind of take the pressure of a deadline off this year. So you just kind of have to know your limits.
But I think that's really encouraging for moms out there who have a dream for something they'd like to do, whether that's writing or some other form of creativity or a job they're looking toward. And they're in a season where it seems really difficult to figure out how these babies they love and that thing that they love, how those things are going to coexist peacefully. And to just recognize there are seasons and rhythms to all of this. And to not feel that sense, as I have felt from time to time, like, oh, I got to make this happen now, but that season where you're just sort of walking the walk and living life can be a really beautiful time for gathering up those things that then get expressed in those creative modalities that you're looking towards. So
yeah.
Well,
and that's encouragement to me too. Yeah. It's hard to even, like, I'm even in the season, I'm like, I took this year off on purpose. Like I don't, but you still have that thing in the back of your head that's like, you should be writing or you should be doing something.
What are you doing?
Like,
what are you doing?
Yeah, it's so hard.
Yeah, but I think, and not to over spiritualize, but I do think a lot about in the Word where God would allow them to work their fields, and then they were to have a year that it was to lie fallow, and how important it was for the soil to receive those nutrients, for it to rest. In those seasons where I've had an extended time that has been a challenge with one of the kids, when we've been in heavy PTOT with Mercy, for example, or auditory verbal therapy with Macy, or a kid who's struggling in whatever arena, and to recognize those now, I wasn't good at it at the time, but now I can look back and go, oh, that was a fallow field season for a reason, and I can tell you the fruit that came out of it later. It's just hard in the grips of it to feel like it's doing anything fruitful other than just making you bananas.
It is, but I'm so glad you mentioned that though, because that actually has been speaking to my heart lately too. So it's not over spiritualizing. I remember, I feel like God specifically gave me that whole fallow. Because it's a whole year
yes.
It's not like for 2 days you're going to take a break. It's a whole year that field lays producing nothing, but it's like you said, it's regaining all of its nutrients that it's been depleted of. So it is so important.
Yeah, I think it is. Well, Katie, it has been just awesome getting to talk with you. We're so excited about the latest book, No One Ever Asked. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Find out more about Katie, her family, her experience as a mom, both of a biological child and having adopted a child, and her writing process, her novels, and more at katieganshert.com. And you spell Ganshert, Ganshert. And I would love to connect with you too at julielylescarr.com on all the socials, as well as Julie Lyles Carr. And be sure and check out my book, Raising an Original. Hey, big thank yous to Rebecca Beckett. She's our content coordinator, and to Donna Toti, our amazing producer. They are the ones who every week make sure that we can get this to your inboxes. And speaking of that, make sure that you've subscribed, and we would be so honored if you would be sure and share the Modern Motherhood Podcast with your friends, and leave us a comment on iTunes or wherever you subscribe to your podcast. Somehow in all the magic world of algorithms, the more that you put out those good feels for us, you rate us with 5 stars, you leave a great comment, all of that helps other people be able to find the podcast as well. So we would so appreciate if you would do that for us. Another great resource for you, AllMomDoes.com, a collection of fantastic bloggers from across the U.S., all speaking into this place of being moms, how to balance work and relationships and kids, and all kinds of tips and tricks for the season that you're in. That's AllMomDoes.com. Coming up next week, I really loved this interview with Dorena Williamson. She is such a delight. She has 2 children's books out that you are for sure going to want to know about and make sure you have in your home. And we're going to have a really compelling conversation about how to talk to our kids about people who are different than them, how to equip them, how to help them understand the way that we manage differences and respect differences in one another. It is a conversation you don't want to miss, critical for anyone parenting today. I'll see you next time on the Modern Motherhood Podcast.